A number of years ago, when my colleague Dr. Mario Chandler and I were sharing the challenge of doing a learning community that connected a section of Narratives of the Self with a first-year seminar, our title was Eyes on Africa, and it was at that time that I, for that reason, chose to include a West African epic poem into the curriculum and that section, and have continued to teach Sunyata over the years in my section. And then this past fall got to thinking about how that oral tradition might connect to contemporary writing and what is specific about work coming out of an oral tradition. And so I chose to include a novel from Joseph Zobel, who is from Martinique and wrote in French. And we read the novel in English. The English translation of the novel is Black Shack Alley. It also was adapted for the cinema in a very fine film by Ouzan Palsi, and that English title is Sugarcane Alley. But that is what I plan to talk to you about today, making these kinds of connections. And then last semester I gave my students a prompt dealing with, I always give them choices of what they write on, and one of the choices was about storytelling, and one of my students, not many chose that subject, but one of them did and wrote a particularly good paper. That student is Joshua Solomon, and Joshua has allowed me to conclude my presentation today with his paper. I had asked him to come and read his paper himself, and unfortunately this was not a convenient time for him, but he wished me well and was very willing to let me share that with you today. So that's the plan of the afternoon. The Odyssey, a longtime cornerstone of the narrative's core course, is oral in its inception and bears many a trace of orality in its written transcription as a text of the enigmatic Homer. We learn of the adventures of Odysseus, the hero of the epic poem, upon leaving Troy, as he tells his story to the Phaeacians on the island of Scheria. And I'm sure especially colleagues have other pronunciations of some of these words. That's how I do it. I've been told by classicists that no one really knows for sure, so it doesn't matter so much. Odysseus has been shipwrecked there on a raft of his own making in his attempt to return to Ithaca and his beloved Penelope. In typical fashion for Odysseus, characterized by craftiness, he does not at first tell the Phaeacians who he is fearful of how they might respond. It is only when he is teased into showing his prowess in athletic games that he ultimately reveals his identity at the beginning of Book 9, which constitutes the real beginning of the story of his voyage from Troy to Ithaca. And here I'm quoting from the Lattimore translation. "I am Odysseus, son of Laertes, known before all men for the study of crafty designs, and my fame goes up to the heavens. I am at home in sunny Ithaca. There is a mountain there that stands tall, leaf-trembling Neritos, and there are islands settled around it, lying one very close to another. There is Dulichium and Same, wooded Zakynthos, but my island lies low and away, last of all of the water toward the dark, with the rest below facing east and sunshine, a rugged place, but a good nurse of men. For my part, I cannot think of any place sweeter on earth to look at." End of quotes. Here, Homer takes his time with Odysseus presenting his homeland. We get to know the surrounding area and even are informed about the rugged island's personality which Odysseus finds sweeter than any place on earth. If we are initial readers in a core class, looking forward to getting an assignment or a paper written, we may well want Odysseus just to get on with it. In fact, we, the readers, already know that Odysseus is from Ithaca and is trying to get home. Can't Homer just get on with it? Well, no, he can't. The very point of telling this story in the first place is that you don't just get on with it, but rather you savor each drawn-out moment in the spirit of the storyteller around a campfire, or the way someone might proceed in NPR's StoryCorps. I tell my students to be patient and guide them into coming to appreciate the digressions and diversions from the narrative, as it were, as some of the finest morsels of the storytelling feast set before us by someone who was not a writer, but an oral poet who memorized all his lines and sang them, constantly retelling his story in slightly new and revised versions. The storyteller might well sometimes make these changes due to the makeup of his audience. Think about how someone might tell the story of the Alamo to a school class of Texas school children, as opposed to some Northerners who had hardly heard of the place, not to mention a group of Mexican children who knew something of their history. All of this calls for patience on the part of the listener, that is to say, the reader, who must find a means to listen her way through the text. There's also a stylistic element here. Our stories, and therefore our literature, began as poetry, not prose. In a tradition I know well, there were transcribed texts of the stories of bards and troubadours in France long before any prose was written down. And the texts were meant to be sung. The first prose in written form to appear in the medieval period in France were sermons, not stories. Why verse and not prosaic narrative? Well, for one thing, if you are an itinerant teller of stories with no script, it is much easier to remember rhymed verse than dry text. It is also more attractive to the ear, just as the verse translation of the Odyssey by Richmond Lattimore is richer and ultimately more engaging than a drier narrative that simply communicates the plot, almost completely missing the point of telling the story in the first place. This is what the London Times Literary Supplement had to say about Lattimore's translation, as cited on the back cover of the 1991 paperback edition by Harper Perennial. And I quote, "Lattimore has, in fact, come about as near as any man could to conveying in English the utterly alien movement and structure of Homer's poetry. It would be a crime to underestimate the miraculous and self-effacing artistry with which Professor Lattimore has reanimated Homer for this generation and perhaps for other generations to come." End of quotes. A literary conversation over the centuries has more or less come to the conclusion that it is impossible to completely separate form and content in written text. The way a text is written is part of the meaning of the text itself, inseparable from the story, the plot, the narrative, or whatever else you may want to call it. Therefore, speaking aloud and singing a story is part of the story itself. All of this may seem paradoxical. Here we have a story which comes out of an oral tradition to which we have access only by the written word. But this means that we must read and listen in a particular way. The first thing we need in this venture is patience, lots of it, and time. Now there is something that we have plenty of in our contemporary society, right? That's not a problem. It doesn't matter that it has gotten late, that we are tired. Who turns a sports event off our screens midway through an exciting contest? That is the spirit we need, and it is the spirit which is modeled for us by our storyteller Homer himself in his epic poem, the Odyssey. When Odysseus has gotten partway through his story for the Phaeacians, and it has gotten late, here is how King Alcinous responds. And all of my quotations are from Lattimore, of course. Here's my quote. "But come now, tell me this, and give me an accurate answer. Did you see any of your godlike companions who once with you went to Ilion and there met their destiny? Here is a night that is very long. It is endless. It is not time yet to sleep in the palace. But go on telling your wonderful story. I myself could hold out until the bright dawn, if only you could bear to tell me, here in the palace, of your sufferings." End of quote. This is, moreover, not the only time Homer makes us aware of the process of storytelling and calls upon the reader to listen. When Odysseus finally arrives in Ithaca, of course, he does not reveal himself to his faithful servant Eumaeus, but takes on a personage who has his own made-up story and past. As, once again, it gets late and time to go to bed, this time it is Eumaeus telling his own story of kidnapping and enslavement, who calls for more story and not sleep as he replies to disguised Odysseus. Another quote. "My guest, since indeed you are asking me all these questions, listen in silence and take your pleasure, and sit there drinking your wine. These nights are endless, and a man can sleep through them, or he can enjoy listening to stories, and you have no need to go to bed before it is time. Too much sleep is only a bore. And of the others, anyone whose heart and spirit urge him can go outside and sleep, and then, when the dawn shows, breakfast first, then go out to tend the swine of our master. But we, too, sitting here in the shelter, eating and drinking," does that sound good? "Shall entertain each other, remembering and retelling our sad sorrows. For afterwards, a man who has suffered much and wondered much has pleasure out of his sorrows. So I will tell you now the answer to all your questions." Eumaeus then goes on to explain how, as a young child, he was kidnapped by his Phoenician nurse and merchants from her home country in order to benefit from selling him into slavery, the offer being made by the nurse in order to gain passage back to her homeland. Here is what the nurse says. "And there is another thing I would willingly give you to pay for my way home. I am nurse to the man's son in his palace, such a cunning child as he runs around outside. If I could take him aboard your ship, he would bring you a price beyond counting, wherever you might sell him among alien-speaking people." End of quote. This retelling of suffering connects to the way in which Paul D. and Sethe, in Toni Morrison's Beloved, another core text, respond to the need to retell the past, even if Sethe finds only pain in the retelling and not the pleasure evoked by the ancient Greek Homer. Sethe finds herself lulled into hearing her own oral history from Paul D., a story which seems to take on its own life and force itself upon the listener. She responds by saying to herself in anger that she just can't shut the story of suffering out once it appears, thus putting into question the storytelling itself, a major theme in the novel. And here I quote from Beloved. "Sethe opened the front door and sat down on the porch steps. The day had gone blue without its sun, but she could still make out the black silhouettes of trees in the meadow beyond. She shook her head from side to side, resigned to her rebellious brain. Why was there nothing it refused? No misery, no regret, no hateful picture too rotten to accept. Like a greedy child, it snatched up everything. Just once, could it say, "No, thank you? I just ate and can't hold another bite." But my greedy brain says, "Oh, thanks, I love more." So I add more. And no sooner than I do, there is no stopping. And if Paul D. saw my husband and could not save or comfort him because the iron bit was in his mouth, then there is still more that Paul D. could tell me, and my brain would go right ahead and take it and never say, "No, thank you." I don't want to know or have to remember that. I have other things to do. Worry, for example, about tomorrow, about Denver, about beloved, about age and sickness, not to speak of love. End of quote. This is about a personal story, just as that of Eumaeus was memory as a personal story to be told or not to be told. The Odyssey is full of moments when Odysseus is overwhelmed by his personal story and unable to either recount it or listen to it. In fact, when we first meet him in the epic poem on Calypso's island of Ogygia, he is full of anguish. Quote from the Odyssey. But Hermes did not find great-hearted Odysseus indoors, but he was sitting out on the beach, crying, as before now he had done, breaking his heart in tears, lamentation, and sorrow. As weeping tears, he looked out over the barren water. This brings us a little closer to how story may be more closely attached to memory and oral history than our literary narrative and the plot of a novel. There is something singular about the notion of story, and it connects to oral discourse. It is at once more insistent and more supple than the written word. Stories have survived through centuries due to written transcription, but the published, inalterable text has a complex and troubled relationship with oral storytelling, something which needs to be taken into account when approaching oral-based texts like the Odyssey, and, I would assert, even a modernist, literarily sophisticated text like Toni Morrison's Beloved. The litany, which concludes the Morrison novel, reads as follows. It was not a story to pass on. One of the paragraphs expanding on this notion speaks of a tale and says, quote, after they made up their tales, shaped and decorated them, those that saw her, beloved, that day on the porch, quickly and deliberately forgot her. Remembering seemed unwise. And another extrapolation states, quotes, so they forgot her, like an unpleasant dream during a troubling sleep. Sometimes the photograph of a close friend or relative, looked at too long, shifts, and something more familiar than the dear face itself moves there. They can touch it if they like, but don't, because they know things will never be the same if they do. End of quote. This brings up another issue closely connected to the oral tradition and storytelling, the archiving of stories and the way to reproduce the story and stories of history. It is interesting to note that in French, story and history are the same word, histoire. This issue resonates particularly strongly with the tradition of African epic, a close cousin to the kind of oral-based story told by Homer in the Odyssey. Sunyata is an epic poem from West Africa, part of the epic storytelling belt which descends the Atlantic coast of the continent and then crosses the Congolese heartland as it reaches the Indian Ocean. The West African bard, troubadour, or Homeric poet is called a griot. And I learned in class that most students have not come across this term before we talk about it. Of course, it's being written in French, so it's spelled G-R-I-O-T, griot. The griot serves not only as storyteller, but also as historian and spokesperson for royalty. He embodies the archives of the society in his person and is virtually the only source for a country's history in this region. Similar to a poet like Homer, the griot depends upon memorization and song to reproduce the epic, and thus needs to start at the beginning of the story and continue on uninterrupted to its conclusion. Perry Francis, the guide and resource person for several field trips organized by Dr. Chandler and myself to the national park site of the Kingsley Plantation outside Jacksonville, Florida, traces her heritage back to Anna Majinjin Jai Kingsley. Perry spoke at a symposium last year in a session organized by our students. Anna came to the plantation as an enslaved 13-year-old Senegalese princess and ultimately married Zephaniah Kingsley, becoming a free person who was left in charge of the property when her husband fled with their son George to a region of Haiti, which is now part of the Dominican Republic. He did so when the British took over from the Spanish and put in question the rights of free people of color, and therefore the right of Kingsley's male heir to inherit the plantation property. Perry tells me that when visiting Senegal to learn of her heritage, she had occasion to listen to griots retell the country's history. In doing so, the griot would have to begin at the beginning and not be interrupted, forcing Perry to listen carefully for any details of importance to her own personal story. This presents an interesting way to consider historical research, one in which the story would have to always be considered only in its entirety from oral cover to cover. In turn, this brings up another issue, that of the permission to transcribe the oral into the written. Griots have traditionally been hostile to this process, claiming that only the oral storyteller can adequately and correctly interpret the past. This was the case when D.T. Niane, a young Senegalese graduate student studying in France, chose to write his master's thesis on this aspect of his country's heritage. He returned to Senegal and found a griot willing to let him write down the epic story of Sundiata, emperor of ancient Mali. It is this text, in translation from French, which my students studied last semester in Narratives 1 as a parallel epic to that of the Odyssey, and another example of oral-based literature from ancient sources. With this in mind, I also asked the students to read Black Shack Alley, a novel written by Martinican Joseph Zobel, which includes a sage in a community of descendants from African slaves, an old man who reproduces the oral traditions of the continent he called Guinea. This gave us yet another example of transcribed oral tradition, something I suggested to my students as a possible topic for a paper. And here is the prompt that I gave the students. Compare the griot Balafaseke in Sundiata with Mr. Meduse in Black Shack Alley. Despite obvious differences, what do the two storytellers have in common? Be specific with references to the text. You may also want to consider commentary about storytelling in these two texts. This was one of several prompts, and few of my students chose to write about it. I expect that one concern for them was the complicated discussion about storytelling, something I have tried to present to you today. However, one of my students, Joshua Solomon, chose to write about it. He wrote an excellent paper, and as I told you initially, unfortunately he's not able to be with us, but as a fitting conclusion to this consideration of how oral and written intermesh in our core narratives class, I'd like you to hear his paper. We narratives instructors ought to perhaps think more about this oral tradition as we craft appropriate assignments for our students, both written and oral. And perhaps there are ways for this issue to inform other report courses. So here is Joshua's paper. The Power of Storytelling. History is an interesting topic in which the very story of a land and the people who inhabit that land is told. It gives us an impression of the past so that we can know the development of our world and so that we may learn of where we came from. It is well known that we must learn from the past to forge the future. Prior to the utilization of written text, the majority of these accounts came in the form of spoken word or oral tradition. The stories of people were passed down from generation to generation in a way that immortalized their culture. Storytelling in the form of stories, poems, and songs all recounted the tales and wondrous developments that people went through, or, for a better term, their oral history. We have seen in various cultures just how important storytelling was to the entire cultural structure of those groups of people. From the Greeks and their epic heroes and poems to the Africans and their mysterious griots, storytelling is a basic aspect of ancient peoples, and still so today. The griots gave personality to their occupation and put their souls into relaying the past and recording the present, thus adding to their repertoire of knowledge. In an epic of Ode Mali, Sundiata's griot, Balafaseke, has a prominent role in the fact that he is in the line of griots who service the king. He sings in praise of Sundiata and, just like his father, will one day pass along his knowledge of the escapades of the king, Sundiata, to his own son. All that survives of the past does so through this character and his lineage as a griot. We see this importance of the theme of storytelling in the novel Black Shack Alley as well. The old man, known as Méduse, is one of the many storytellers in this novel, and it is he who gives entertainment to the young protagonist, José. José's infatuation and interest in the old man's stories of Africa give him exposure to not only the past, but also to a close companion, so very similar to Sundiata's relationship with Balafaseke. While these two storytellers have great differences, both Balafaseke and Méduse share a lot in common. These common traits are numerous, however, two stand out the most: their importance or functionality and their lineage. Both Méduse from Black Shack Alley and Balafaseke from an epic of Ode Mali have a lot in common in regards to their roles as storytellers in their respective books. Of course, it is simple to state that one of these similarities is the fact that both are storytellers in their own right. However, one must take it further than that in order to adequately illustrate just how central storytelling is to African culture. Within the preface of an epic of Ode Mali, D.T. Nyane states, quotes, "In the very hierarchical society of Africa before colonization, where everyone found his place, the griot appears as one of the most important of this society, because it is he who, for want of archives, records the customs, traditions, and governmental principles of kings." End of quote. This illustrates just how important griots were to African society. They were, in simplest terms, the recorders and interpreters of history who served the king. It is true that griots are important to the entire society. However, in both Balafaseke and Méduse's cases, they have one person who is closest to them. Balafaseke has Sundiata, while Méduse had José. José and Méduse do, in fact, have a stronger bond. José often quotes, "Longed for only one thing, waited for only one thing, to have the voice of Mr. Méduse call him." End of quote. While traditional African griots like Balafaseke were important to the king and society, Mr. Méduse had a special place in José's heart, as he longed for his stories and enjoyed listening to his wisdom. While this type of importance is true, another still rises above friendship or love to others. It is true that a griot's job, in a sense, was to keep the tradition of Africa alive. This, too, is where the importance of Mr. Méduse lies. Méduse passes away during José's childhood years. This is due to his extensive labor in the white-owned sugarcane fields and his advanced age. After he dies, the narrator, José, states, and this is a quote from the novel, "But despite its length and complicated nature, this wake kept me up so much that in the long run, even in the darkness, I could make out all the traits in the face and all the expressions of the master storyteller, carried away by his feelings into the magical domain to which he lifted up his enraptured audience. And each time that he raised the hymn to their most intoxicating fullness, I expected to see the body of the old black man lying stiff on its too narrow plank also rise up in the night and set off for Guinea." I will abbreviate the paper and conclude with Joshua's final paragraph, which will also be a conclusion for me. Both Méduse and the griot Balafaseke are influential in the stories of Black Jack Alley and an epic of Old Mali, respectively. It is through their importance as storytellers and their lineages that their true importance lies. These two men embody just how central storytelling and oral tradition was to African culture. Even with the influence of another country, like France, in Méduse's case, these stories still exist and flourish. The importance of the griot or storyteller is best conveyed in the preface of An Epic of Old Mali, when it is stated, this is a quote, "May this book open the eyes of more than one African and induce him to come and sit humbly beside the ancients and hear the words of the griots who teach wisdom and history." End of quote. These two men allow for the spirit of Africa to continue to live on. It is they who, through their stories, give the gift of wisdom and history to the younger generations, for it is this knowledge of those who came before that allows others to build a brighter future.